The clipboard hit the floor. That was the first thing Liaison Commander Veth noticed. Not the weapon, not the human soldier standing 3 meters away, not the 4,000-year archive of galactic disarmament treaties scrolling across her secondary visual membrane. Just the clipboard. Thin aluminum, bent at one corner, the sound of it striking the polished floor of the disarmament chamber ringing out like something had been dropped from a very great height. The human who had dropped it was not looking at it. He was looking at the treaty. His face was doing something Veth's translation matrices had no category for. It wasn't anger. It wasn't grief. It was something older than both, something that lived below expression in a place her species had never needed to map, and the silence that followed the clipboard's fall lasted exactly 4 seconds before the human bent down, picked it up, and said, "Where do I sign?" Veth would spend the next 11 months trying to understand those 4 seconds. She would eventually conclude that she had been watching the most dangerous thing in the known galaxy, and had mistaken it, completely, for surrender. The Covenant of Measured Voices had disarmed 63 species in 412 years. The process was not cruel. That distinction mattered deeply to the Covenant, particularly to its senior members, who had watched enough civilizations destroy themselves from the inside to understand that disarmament was, philosophically speaking, an act of love. You took away the weapon. You preserved the hand that had held it. The species survived. The weapon did not. Everyone, eventually, came to understand. 63 species, not one had resisted beyond the second consultation phase. They always reached the same conclusion. Senior Arbiter Dosmel had explained to Veth before her assignment, his 4-chambered voice producing the particular harmonic of institutional certainty that only comes from having been right many times in a row. When a species understands the alternative, isolation, economic embargo, the withdrawal of Covenant medical technology, they sign. They sign because they are rational. Intelligence, properly applied, always arrives at self-preservation. And if it doesn't? Veth had asked. Dosmel had looked at her the way her professors once had when she asked questions that revealed she was thinking too laterally. Then it isn't properly applied, he said. That's rather the point. She had arrived on Earth 31 standard days ago. She had initiated the standard consultation sequence. She had presented the terms, generous terms, historically speaking, with a 12-year transition timeline and full retention of domestic security forces. The humans had listened. Then they had asked for 48 hours. Then they had asked for 48 more. Then a man named Sergeant First Class David Arroyo had walked into her consultation chamber alone, without his delegation, without announcement, picked up the treaty documents, and read every page while standing. This had taken 2 hours and 19 minutes. Veth had waited. When he finished, he had set the pages down, picked up the clipboard attached to the signature block, and then, for 4 seconds, stood completely still. She didn't know his rank was the equivalent of a mid-level field officer. She didn't know he had no authority to sign anything. She didn't know what he had been doing in the 48 hours before he walked through her door, or what the expression on his face actually meant. She would learn, piece by piece, over the next 11 months. Each answer would be worse than the question it replaced. The first mystery presented itself on day 33. Veth's cultural integration team, 3 analysts and a xenopsychologist named Prill, who had spent her career studying species that used physical pain as social bonding, had been mapping human responses to the treaty's public announcement. Standard procedure. 63 species. It always generated a predictable curve: initial resistance, public grief, gradual acceptance, eventual appreciation. Human response followed the curve for exactly 6 days. Then it stopped following it entirely. "They're not grieving," Prill said, pulling up the behavioral data with an expression Veth had never seen on her face before. Prill was extremely difficult to unsettle. She had once cataloged a species that communicated exclusively through self-inflicted lacerations and had filed her report with the calm of someone describing weather. They're not accepting either. She paused. I don't have a category for this. Show me. The data resolved into something that looked, at first, like normal social activity. Humans gathering in groups, humans in conversation, humans sharing food. They did that constantly, at a rate that had initially flagged as resource distribution anxiety before Prill determined it was something else entirely. They're not processing the treaty, Prill said. They're doing something else, something that started before the announcement and accelerated after it. What? I don't know yet, that's the problem. Prill pulled up a secondary layer. Communication frequencies, the specific architecture of their network data, the patterns of physical movement between human population centers. But whatever it is, they're coordinating it across every continent, across every faction we identified as politically opposed to one another. She highlighted a cluster of data points. These two nations have been in a territorial dispute for 60 years. They haven't coordinated anything in that time. In the last 6 days, there have been 412 direct communications between them. Veth studied the display. About what? Prill looked at her. We don't know. The encryption is... She stopped again. It's not encryption we've seen before. It's not encryption at all. Technically, it's a communications format we don't have a baseline for. Veth filed the anomaly. She assumed it would resolve. It didn't resolve. On day 39, Sergeant David Arroyo came back. He came alone again, which was irregular. Veth had noticed that humans rarely did anything important alone. They moved in social clusters, made decisions in committees, required the presence of others to validate their choices. It was a species-level anxiety about individual action. She understood it. Many social species shared it. Arroyo seemed to lack it entirely. He sat down across from her in the consultation chamber. Sat, which was also irregular, because most human representatives stood during official interactions as a dominance display she had cataloged in Section 7 of her cultural primer. And he looked at her for a moment before speaking. I want to ask you something, he said. Professionally, of course. In the 63 disarmaments your organization has conducted. He said organization the way humans said words when they meant something slightly different. How many of the species that signed are still using Covenant medical technology right now? Veth paused. I'm not certain of the exact figure, 51, he said. I looked it up. 51 of your 63 are still dependent on technology they didn't have before they signed. The other 12 developed their own. How many of those 12 retained full military capability? Veth said nothing. 0, Arroyo said. Because the treaty structure removes dual-use research infrastructure, not just weapons. You know that. I know that now. He looked at her steadily. I'm not angry about it. I just want you to know that we know. He stood up, nodded once, a small, compressed gesture she had no category for, and left. Veth sat very still for a long time after he was gone. She filed a report to Dosmel that evening. She included Arroyo's comments verbatim, the anomalous communications data, the pattern disruption in the grief curve. She added, at the end, a single line she had not planned to write until she was halfway through composing it. I believe the humans are planning something. I do not yet know what. Dosmel's response arrived within the hour. All species believe they are planning something at this stage. It is part of the process. Continue. She was wrong to trust that instruction. So was he. Second mystery arrived on day 44 in a form she almost missed entirely. Her environmental monitoring team had been scanning Earth's surface for weapons caches, standard post-announcement procedure, mapping what would eventually need to be decommissioned. They were thorough. They used 11 different detection modalities across 3 electromagnetic bands. They had done this on 63 worlds. The scan came back almost clean. Almost. There are structures we can't classify. The team's lead, a specialist named Arath, said, projecting the scan results. Scattered points of light across every continent, concentrated near mountain ranges, coastlines, underground river systems. They're not weapons facilities. They don't match any military architecture in our database. They're not agricultural. They're not industrial. He expanded the projection. Some of them are very old, centuries. Some were built in the last 6 days. What are they doing in them? Veth asked. We don't know. They're not transmitting anything we can detect. They're not consuming unusual energy. People go in. People come out. Sometimes they stay for days. Aerith pulled up a thermal image, bodies packed closely together in a space that should have been uncomfortable at that density. They seem to be storing things, but the objects don't read as weapons. They don't read as anything our systems can identify. Veth thought about the encrypted communications, the coordination between enemies, the structures in the mountains. How many, she asked. How many of these structures? Orth looked at his data. Globally? He paused. About 40,000. The number sat in the room with them for a moment. In 6 days, she said. Some were pre-existing, but the new construction, yes. 6 days. He pulled the projection down. Commander, one more thing. The humans who go in and out of these structures, we've been running behavioral analysis on the ones we have visual on. They're not stressed. They're not hurrying. They're not moving like people who are afraid. What are they moving like? Uarith considered his answer for a moment, in a way that told her he had considered it before and not liked where it led. Like people who've already made a decision, he said, and are now just doing the work. Day 47, the third mystery. The delegation finally arrived. 11 humans representing, nominally, the majority of Earth's administrative coalition. Veth had expected this to feel like progress. The preliminary individual meetings, the anomalous data, the waiting, all of it would finally resolve into the formal structure of negotiation, which was a thing she understood and was good at. The delegation sat down. Their lead representative, a woman named Ambassador Quan Ji-yan, opened a folder, physical paper, which the humans used for things they considered important enough to not trust to networks, and looked across the table at Veth. Before we begin the formal signature process, Quan said, we have a question. Of course, Veth said. If we sign this treaty, what happens to the 41 species you disarmed who no longer have the capacity to resist a covenant policy change? Silence. That's a hypothetical scenario, Veth said carefully. It's a historical observation, Quan said. We've been reading your history, not the public record, the actual administrative archive. Your legal framework has been amended 14 times in 400 years. 3 of those amendments reduced the autonomy of previously disarmed species. She turned a page. We'd like to know the mechanism by which a disarmed species would resist a future amendment they found unacceptable. Veth had been in 63 disarmament consultations, as a junior analyst, as a cultural attaché, as a liaison commander. No species had ever asked that question, not because they couldn't think of it. She understood that now. Because by the time the consultation reached the formal delegation stage, the species had already crossed the psychological threshold of acceptance. They were already thinking about life after the treaty. The humans were not thinking about life after the treaty. They were still thinking about the treaty itself. I'll need to refer that question to Senior Arbiter. We've already submitted it to Senior Arbiter Das Mel, Quan said pleasantly. 3 days ago, we haven't received a response. She closed the folder. We're patient. We'll wait. Das Mel arrived on Earth on day 52. He did not tell Veth he was coming. She learned when his transport entered low orbit and her protocols flagged the Senior Arbiter's signature. By the time she reached the landing platform, he was already walking toward her, and the particular set of his expression, all 4 layers of it, which in her species conveyed emotional information in parallel channels that humans would have needed several sentences to express, told her that he was more unsettled than she had ever seen him. "They're not afraid," he said, without preamble. "No," she agreed. "Every species at this stage is afraid. Not necessarily of us. They're afraid of the wrong choice, of signing and losing something, of not signing and losing something else. Fear moves them toward the signature line because it moves them toward resolution." He stopped walking. "The humans are not afraid. What do they feel?" He looked at her. "I don't know. My translators keep flagging it as a processing error. The emotional register doesn't match any category in our database." He was quiet for a moment. "I sat with 3 of their delegates this morning. Informally. Do you know what they talked about? No? Recipes," he said, "for the first 40 minutes. Food preparation techniques. Regional variations." Then, completely unprompted, one of them, the older one with the gray at his temples, said, "You know what I keep thinking about? My grandfather built a fallout shelter in 1962. He canned vegetables down there for 20 years. Never needed it. He died in that house at 89, but he never stopped adding to it." Then they went back to talking about recipes. Veth stared at him. "What does it mean?" "I don't know," Dosmel said. And the fact that he was admitting it, Dosmel, who had phrased every uncertainty of his 400-year career as a category of insufficient information rather than genuine unknowing, sat between them like the dropped clipboard, ringing. The recording was found on day 61. It was not technically hidden. That was the part that made it worse. One of Veth's analysts, running a routine archive cross-reference of human historical data, stumbled across a repository that had been publicly accessible the entire time, open to anyone with the right search parameters, filed under an administrative designation that translated roughly as Civil Continuity Planning Documentation, standard bureaucratic language. The kind of folder that accumulates paperwork no one reads. The analyst read it. She flagged it immediately. Veth read it in her quarters at 0300 ship standard time, alone, and then she sat in the dark for a long time before she called Dosmel. "The structures," she said when he answered. "The 40,000 structures our scan couldn't classify. What about them?" "I know what they are." She looked at the document on her screen. "They're not new. The concept isn't new. Humans have been building versions of them for as long as they've had civilizations. They have a specific word for the principle. The documents use several words: continuity infrastructure, preservation caches, cultural redoubts. But there's an older word. She read it. Arcs. Silence on the line. They built 40,000 arcs, she said, in the 6 days after our treaty announcement. And the older ones, the ones that have existed for centuries in every culture, on every continent, those weren't fear responses to specific threats. They were. She stopped. Dosmel, they build these by instinct. They don't need a reason. They don't need to know what's coming. They just preserve. They preserve everything. Seed banks, language archives, art, medical knowledge, engineering schematics. Her voice dropped. Weapons manufacturing specifications. She heard him breathing. They're not planning to resist us, she said. They're planning to survive us, whatever we do to them, whatever we take. They've already copied everything we're trying to remove, and they've put it somewhere we can't reach, and they've been doing this for 10,000 years as a default behavior because... She stopped again. Dosmel, what did you tell me? That intelligence properly applied always arrives at self-preservation? Yes, he said quietly. They've applied it, she said. We just didn't understand what self-preservation meant to them. She asked to meet Arroyo the next morning. He arrived without surprise, as if he had been expecting the meeting, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he operated. A state of continuous readiness that didn't register the future as uncertain so much as pending. The arcs, she said. He didn't react. You knew we'd find them eventually. Yes, he said. Why didn't you hide them? Arroyo looked at her for a moment. Why would we? Because they contain everything we are, he said. Yes, that's the point. You can have the weapons, the delivery systems, the manufacturing capacity, the military infrastructure. You can document all of it and remove all of it, and we'll sign your treaty on your timeline. But you're asking us to give up the ability to harm. You can't ask us to give up the ability to remember. He looked at his hands. My grandmother was born in a country that doesn't exist anymore. Her government was erased. Her language was nearly erased. Her people kept it alive for 50 years underground, until they could speak it in public again. He looked up. We remember how to do that. We've always remembered how to do that. Beth said nothing for a long moment. If you understand that we found the arcs, she said slowly, and you understand what they contain, you understand this changes the treaty structure. The Covenant cannot disarm something that doesn't rely on its weapons to persist, Arroyo said. Not hostile, not triumphant, just factual. We know. Then why are you still at the table? He looked at her with an expression she was finally, after 61 days, beginning to develop a category for. It lived in the same emotional space as patience and grief, and something that wasn't quite hope. Something older than hope. Something that didn't require a positive outcome to sustain itself. Because we'd rather not use the arcs, he said. That's why we're still talking. Doss Mel convened an emergency session. He brought in 3 additional senior arbiters from the nearest Covenant hub, 12 hours travel at maximum transit speed. They arrived looking the way officials always look when they've been told something is urgent and are still deciding whether to be annoyed or afraid. They reviewed the data, all of it, the arcs, the communications, the behavioral profiles, the question about the 41 dependent species, the moment in the chamber when Arroyo had known exact treaty statistics that their own junior analysts had needed to look up. The eldest arbiter, a being named Vessel of Many Verdicts, who had personally overseen 20 disarmaments and was widely considered the institutional memory of the Covenant's entire enforcement arm, looked at the data for a very long time before speaking. How long have they been preparing for first contact? She asked. Veth blinked. Preparing? This is not a species in reaction mode, Vessel said. The arcs predate our arrival. The communication networks we can't decrypt, some of those protocols predate our arrival. The treaty statistics that their field officer had memorized. She looked up. Commander Veth, when did humanity develop faster than light communication? They haven't, Veth said. They don't have FTL. Then how did a mid-ranking military officer have access to and have memorized Covenant administrative statistics that are not in our public record 7 days after we made first contact? The room was very quiet. We assumed, Bessel said slowly, that humanity was unaware of us before our arrival. That is the standard condition for species at their technological development level. They should not have known we existed. She was very still. When did they know we existed? No one answered, because no one knew. And the question meant something terrible, because if humanity had known, if they had been watching, mapping, studying, preparing, then the 48 hours they'd asked for after the treaty announcement had been time to grieve. It had been time to implement something they'd already planned. Find out, Vessel said. Find out when they knew. Find out what they built based on that knowledge. Find out what else is in those arcs that we haven't looked for yet. She stood. And someone tell me what that man's expression meant. The one in the chamber? When he read the treaty. The commander's report described it as something without a category. I want that category found. She looked at Veth directly. Because I have now reviewed 412 years of disarmament records, and I have found 3 prior instances of a species using a word during consultation that our translators couldn't fully render. She paused. In all 3 cases, the treaty failed, not because the species resisted, Because we eventually realized the treaty was unnecessary. They had already neutralized the threat we were trying to contain by a method we hadn't anticipated. She let that land. The word Sergeant Arroyo used when he agreed to sign was not surrender. Our translation matrix called it surrender. It wasn't. What was it? Veth asked. The closest rendering our linguistics team can produce, Vessel said, is approximately, let's begin. They found the second archive on day 77. Not the ARCs. Everyone knew about the ARCs now, and analysts were still working through what was inside them, and the news kept getting more elaborate and more quietly staggering. Seed banks covering 4.2 million plant species. Complete neuro-linguistic maps of every human language, including extinct ones, including ones spoken by fewer than 10 people. Engineering specifications for infrastructure from the wheel to the reactor, organized in pedagogical sequence so they could be taught to anyone from scratch with no prerequisite knowledge. That wasn't the second archive. The second archive was smaller. It had been found by a junior analyst named Ress, who had been assigned to background noise, the category of data that the main team had already determined was irrelevant. She almost didn't flag it. She flagged it because she couldn't explain it, and she had been told to flag anything she couldn't explain. It was a human communications record. Old pre-contact. Definitively pre-contact, which meant it predated Covenant arrival by at minimum 30 years. A conversation between two humans in a language the translator rendered as an Old Earth regional dialect. The content appeared, on first pass, to be personal. Two older individuals discussing something mundane. Then, Ress ran a secondary linguistic analysis. Then she sat very still. Then she called Veth. They knew about the Covenant 40 years ago, she said. Someone knew. Whoever these two individuals are, they're discussing. She hesitated. They're discussing exactly what's happening now. The treaty structure. The dependency mechanism, the medical technology leverage, they describe it in detail. She paused. Commander, they also describe 3 prior Covenant disarmament attempts on Earth that we have no record of. Veth froze. Prior attempts? Before the current mission. This conversation refers to 3 earlier contact events that we apparently, Ress's voice was very careful, that we apparently failed. The Covenant initiated contact with Earth at least 3 times before the current mission, and all 3 times the contact failed to progress to the formal consultation phase, and the records were sealed or lost. She paused. The humans remember all 3. The silence that followed was not the ringing kind, the dropped clipboard kind. It was deeper. The kind that comes when you realize the floor you've been standing on has always been a bridge, and you're only now looking down. How? Veth asked. They wrote it down, Ress said simply. Arroyo accepted her meeting request within minutes. She had stopped finding that ordinary. She had stopped finding anything about him ordinary. I need to know, she said, without greeting. The previous contact attempts. What happened? He didn't confirm or deny. He looked at her steadily. You already know we know, she said. The archive predating our arrival. 43 years old, he said. That conversation, not the knowledge. The knowledge is older. He leaned forward slightly. How much do you actually want to know, Commander? Because I can answer that question, but the answer is going to change things. Tell me. The first attempt was 470 years ago, he said. A probe. Automated. It reached our outer system and transmitted the standard Covenant observation signal. We know that's what it was now. At the time, we didn't have the technology to fully decode it, but we kept the record. He paused. We keep everything. He said it the way someone states weather. The second was 212 years ago, he continued. A ship. It entered our system and observed for 18 months before departing. We didn't have the ability to communicate with it. We watched it. We mapped its movements, its technology signatures, its departure trajectory. We built models based on what we observed. He paused. We've been updating those models ever since. And the third, she said. 60 years ago, that one made contact. Brief. The team that reached us, they offered first terms. Standard consultation opening from what we understand now. He held her gaze. They left after 4 months. We never found out why. We have theories. What happened to them? Nothing, he said quietly. They left. That's what scared us. They left without explanation. And we didn't know if they were coming back, or what form they'd come back in, or how long we'd have. He looked at his hands. 60 years, as it turned out. Long enough to do a lot of reading. She thought about the 40,000 arcs built in 6 days. She thought about the military officer who had memorized administrative statistics from a non-public archive. She thought about a species watching an alien ship for 18 months, 200 years ago, taking notes. She thought about what kind of mind does that? What kind of mind watches something it cannot understand, cannot communicate with, cannot predict, and responds not with fear, not with worship, but with note-taking? You've been preparing for us, she said. We've been preparing for the conversation, he said. There's a difference. What's the difference? He looked at her for a long time. Preparing for you means the outcome is about you. Preparing for the conversation means he stopped. It means we knew the conversation would happen eventually, and we knew we'd need to know what we were and what we wanted before it did. So we spent the time figuring that out instead of building bigger weapons. He paused. The weapons were already built. We didn't need more weapons. We needed to know why we'd fight. And do you know why? Yes, he said. Then tell me. Because we're not afraid of losing, he said. We're afraid of losing and having it not matter, of disappearing and leaving nothing. He looked at her steadily. You can take our weapons. You can take our military infrastructure. You can make us dependent on your medical technology and change your policy 14 more times and reduce our autonomy in ways we can't currently anticipate. All of that is possible. His voice didn't change. But the arcs will still be there, and the people who come out the other side will still know who they are, and eventually, in 10 years or 100 or 1,000, they'll build it back. Whatever we were, they'll build it back. Because they'll have everything they need to do it. And they'll remember why. He stood. That's not defiance, he said. That's just how we're made. The Covenant session lasted 4 days. Veth was not included. That told her everything about how seriously they were taking it. The Covenant's standard practice was to include the field commander in all senior deliberations because local contextual knowledge was considered essential. Excluding her meant they had moved past the point where local context mattered and into territory where the question was architectural, where the question was what you do when you realize the framework you've been using doesn't fit the thing you're trying to put in it. She waited. She walked the corridors of the administrative ship. She ate, though she wasn't hungry. She thought about 63 species and what they had in common and what Earth didn't share with them. On the 3rd night, Prill found her. I figured out the expression, Prill said. She sat down without being invited, which was unlike her. The one from the first day, the one you couldn't categorize. Veth looked at her. I've been running it through every emotional taxonomy in our combined xenopsychology database, Prill said. Nothing fit. So I went back to first principles. What do we see in the physiological markers? Elevated cortisol. Suppressed fear response. Increased executive function. The posture of someone carrying significant weight without complaint. She paused, and then the manual reached for the object. The grounding behavior. The 4-second stillness. What is it? Beth asked. In human psychology, it corresponds most closely to what they call resolution, Prill said. Not resignation, not acceptance, resolution. She looked at Veth. It's the emotional state of someone who is fully committed to a course of action they know will be painful without certainty of success and without the option of surrender. She paused. It's the expression of a person who has decided. Decided what? That's what I couldn't figure out, Prill said, until I read the archive about the prior contact attempts and the arcs and what Arroyo said to you yesterday. Yes, I read the transcript. She was very quiet for a moment. I think when he looked at that treaty, he wasn't deciding whether to sign it. He had already decided that. He was deciding something larger. She looked at her hands. I think he was deciding that the species that built 40,000 arcs in 6 days and took 400 years of notes and spent 60 years preparing for a conversation could survive whatever came next. Even if the treaty was as bad as they thought it was. Even if everything went wrong. She met Veth's eyes. He was deciding they'd make it through, and then he signed. Veth sat with that for a long time. Prill, she said. What do we do with a species like this? Prill looked at her. She had spent her career in xenopsychology. She had studied beings that felt pain as pleasure, beings that experienced time in reverse, beings that had no concept of individual death. She had maintained professional composure through all of it. I don't know, she said. I genuinely don't know, and I think that might be the point. Dosmel came to her on the morning of the 4th day. He looked older. She knew that was partly stress. Their species aged visibly under sustained cognitive load. But it was also something else. A shift in the configuration of certainty that had defined him her entire career. Not broken. Reorganized. We're withdrawing the treaty, he said. She waited. Not abandoning the process, he said quickly. Restructuring it. The current terms are not... He stopped. The senior arbiters have concluded that Earth presents a categorically distinct consultation scenario. The standard framework does not apply. Because they can't be permanently disarmed, she said. Because they don't need to be, he said. He looked at her. Do you understand what that means? We've been treating disarmament as the goal. Remove the weapons, prevent the conflict, preserve the species. But the humans... He stopped again. He did that a lot now, she noticed. Stopped mid-sentence because the sentence kept arriving somewhere unexpected. The threat the Covenant's framework is designed to address is the destruction of civilization by warfare, by a species consuming itself. The arcs mean that even in the worst-case scenario, even total catastrophic warfare, they'd survive, Veth said. They'd survive, and they'd rebuild, and they'd remember, and they'd do it again, he said. And the next version would have the complete record of what destroyed the previous one. He looked at her steadily. You cannot destroy something that is specifically designed to reconstruct itself from its own ruins. So what do we do? He was quiet for a moment. Vessel of many verdicts asked me this morning whether the Covenant has ever considered what it means to disarm a species that cannot be made more vulnerable than it already is. He looked at his hands. She meant that everything the treaty was designed to take: military capability, defensive infrastructure, the capacity for organized violence. The humans carry all of that as knowledge, in their bodies, in their culture, in their archives. You would need to remove the humans themselves to remove human knowledge of warfare. He paused, and she asked me, if we did that, if we somehow removed them entirely, would the galaxy be safer? What did you tell her? I told her I wasn't sure the galaxy could afford to find out, he said quietly, because whatever we've spent 400 years becoming, whatever the Covenant is, some part of it came from knowing something that fights back exists. Somewhere. Something that won't stop. He looked at her. We've never had to become our best selves. We've just had to be consistent. And I wonder, now, whether consistency was ever really the same thing. Arroyo was in the consultation chamber when she arrived. He was sitting again. He had, she noticed, brought coffee. The human drink, bitter and dark, which her analysts had initially flagged as a mild psychoactive and later reclassified as a cultural ritual whose social function was too complex to reduce to pharmacology. He offered her a cup. She sat down and took it, because she had learned that refusing human offers of food or drink during serious conversations was the closest she could come to telling them she didn't trust them, and she was past that. The treaty is being restructured, she said. He nodded. He had known. Of course he had. I need to tell you something, she said, about what the Covenant is, not the public version, the function, what it was actually built for. She set down the cup. 63 species. You know the count. What you may not know is that when the Covenant was founded, 412 years ago, there were 81 species in this region of the galaxy. The 17 we haven't contacted were not overlooked. He went very still. 14 of them are extinct, she said. Pre-Covenant. Some by warfare, some by environmental collapse accelerated by military-industrial damage, some by other means. The remaining 3, she stopped. The remaining 3 are what we call remnant populations. Species that survive their own weapons but not the consequences of using them. They exist. They breathe. They are not what they were. She met his eyes. The Covenant was built to prevent number 18, the 18th extinction. We have not always been right about who needed to be disarmed to prevent it. We have made errors. I have treated this as a process rather than a conversation, and I think that was wrong. She waited. She wasn't sure what she expected him to say. He looked at the coffee cup for a moment. 14 species, he said. In 400 years. Yes. And the Covenant saved. We believe so, she said. Some of them. We can't be certain. Causation across civilization scale events is hard too. 14, he said again. Not accusatory. Just holding the number. Feeling its weight. She watched him do it. Watched the calculation happen not in the calculating part of his mind, but somewhere deeper, in the part that had been building arcs for 10,000 years. We would have been number 15, he said quietly, if we hadn't... He stopped. Or number 15, 16, and 17, depending on how the war went. Yeah, he was quiet for a moment. I understand why you came. Do you also understand, she said carefully, why you terrified us? He looked up. You weren't supposed to know, she said. You weren't supposed to have been preparing. You weren't supposed to be the species that watched an alien ship for 18 months and took notes. You weren't supposed to have 40,000 arcs. She looked at him. Every species we've ever disarmed reached a point where they were afraid of us. That fear was never comfortable to use, but it was predictable. It was a fulcrum we understood. She paused. You're not afraid of us. No, he said. Which means we have no leverage you can't outlast. No, he agreed. Which means, she said, and here she arrived at the thing she had been trying to say for 3 days, you were never actually at risk of being disarmed. Were you? He looked at her for a long moment. Not permanently, he said. No. Then why? She stopped. The treaty. The delegation. The signature. If you knew you couldn't be permanently disarmed, if you had already distributed everything into the arcs, if you'd been preparing for 60 years, why go through the consultation at all? Why not simply tell us no? He picked up the coffee cup, held it for a moment. Because 14 species, he said. Because you came here because you were trying to stop something that has already killed 14 civilizations. Because the process you're using is wrong, but the problem you're trying to solve is real. He set the cup down, and because we might be number 15 anyway someday, without help. He looked at her. We're not peaceful, Commander. We know that. We've spent a lot of time knowing that. We fight each other over things that would seem insane to you. We have. We will. He paused. But we'd rather have a conversation about it than a catastrophe. That's why we stayed at the table. Not because we had to, because we wanted to solve the right problem. The consultation chamber was very quiet. Outside, through the narrow viewport, Earth turned. It was mostly blue from this distance. Mostly water. A thin shell of atmosphere catching the light of a medium star in the middle of nowhere, one planet among several billion, host to a species that had spent its entire existence documenting itself against the possibility of its own extinction and had apparently found time, in between, to wonder about the neighbors. "What do you want?" Veth asked, not diplomatically, not procedurally. "If you could design the outcome, what do you actually want?" "A seat at the table," he said. "Not as a subject species, not under your framework, as a partner." He looked at her. "We have things you need. You know that now. Not weapons, the other things, the arcs, the way we think about persistence, the way we don't give up." He paused. 14 species, you said. We've been 14 species. We've been the one that almost didn't make it. Over and over throughout our entire history, we know what that looks like from the inside. We know how to survive it. He was quiet. "You've been preventing extinctions for 400 years by taking weapons away. We've been surviving them for 10,000 years by refusing to stop." A pause. "Those aren't the same skill, but they might be complementary." The Covenant did not disarm Earth. The amended framework took 8 months to draft, 11 to ratify, and generated more internal dissent than any Covenant policy revision in 200 years. 3 senior arbiters resigned. Dosmel did not. Vessel of Many Verdicts wrote the minority opinion, which was not minority in the pejorative sense. It was a detailed, rigorous argument for caution that acknowledged the case for Earth's inclusion, while insisting on the need for oversight and reciprocal accountability mechanisms that the humans, notably, agreed to without negotiation. Arroyo did not sign the final framework. He was not present for the signing. He had, 6 weeks before the ratification ceremony, been transferred to a different assignment, one that Veth's analysts eventually determined was related to the arcs, specifically to the expansion of a network that already covered 40,000 locations globally and was, apparently, still growing. Veth asked about it, the last time she spoke to him before she shipped out. "Habit," he said. "You're still adding to them," she said. "Even now. Even after, we'll always add to them," he said. "That's not going to change." "That's not about you." He said it without apology. "We do this whether you existed or not, whether any of this happened or not." Why? He thought about it. Not the easy answer. She could see him sorting through the easy answers and setting them aside, looking for the one that was actually true. "Because nothing lasts," he said finally. "We figured that out a long time ago. Nothing lasts. Not civilizations, not languages, not specific ways of loving each other that took 10,000 years to develop. Nothing lasts. So you build the arcs, and you put everything in them, and you hope the next version of yourself can use it." He looked at her. "Not for them, for everyone who came before. Because the only way the people who came before us meant something is if someone after us still knows they existed." He held out his hand, the human gesture. She had learned it by now. She took it. "Safe travels, Commander," he said. She filed her final report at 0400, ship standard, with Earth shrinking in the rear viewport and the translation she had eventually found for that expression on his face in the consultation chamber, the expression she had spent 11 months trying to categorize. The Covenant's linguistic division had ultimately declined to assign it a single word, determining instead that it required a compound phrase drawn from 3 separate lexical traditions: the calm of someone who has accepted the full cost, chosen to pay it anyway, and is now simply doing what must be done. She included it in the report. She added a note beneath it: "We came to Earth to prevent an extinction." We should be honest about what actually happened. We arrived at a species that had already prevented its own multiple times across 10,000 years, without our help, without our framework, without any of the tools we believed were necessary for the task. They did it with something our taxonomy has no clean word for. They called it, variously, stubbornness, faith, love, memory. They built arcs. They wrote things down. They handed it to the next generation and said, "You'll need this." We leave Earth not having disarmed them. We leave Earth not having been resisted. We leave Earth having been shown something none of our 63 prior disarmaments prepared us for. A species that cannot be made more vulnerable than it has already survived being. The galaxy has stronger civilizations. The galaxy has older ones, wiser ones, ones with technologies that would take humanity millennia to replicate. The galaxy has species that have never started a war, species that have transcended the biological imperatives that make violence possible, species that are, by any rational metric, more advanced. But I have read 43 years of pre-contact human documentation, and I have sat in 40,000 arc Earth, and I have watched a mid-ranking officer stand in a treaty chamber for 4 seconds with the weight of 10,000 years on his face, before choosing to keep the conversation alive rather than end it. And I have concluded the following: humanity is not the strongest species in this galaxy. It is not the oldest or the most peaceful or the most evolved. It is not destined for greatness by any mechanism we can identify. It has no special gift, no chosen one narrative, no technological advantage that cannot eventually be matched. What it has is this: it will not stop. Not when it is outmatched. Not when it is disarmed. Not when 14 civilizations around it have already burned. Not when every rational calculation says the cost exceeds the value. It will not stop, and more than that, it will remember. It will put everything it knows into the arcs and hand it to whoever comes next, and that person will not stop either, because they will know who came before them and why it mattered. I do not know if that makes humanity the galaxy's greatest hope. I know it makes them its longest memory, and I know now what the rest of the galaxy has been too comfortable to ask, whether in the end those turn out to be the same thing.